Okay, so I think we'll get started. I want to thank you all very much for coming to this, the second meeting in our pandemic year of the Labor and Humanities Seminar. And we're really delighted on behalf of the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies to welcome Professor Sarah Milov from the University of Virginia, Department of History, to tell us about some of her recent research on the culture and history of whistleblowing in the United States. Before we begin, we wish to acknowledge the land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So, having acknowledged the land on which the University of Toronto is, where the University of Toronto operates, it's my pleasure to just introduce an old friend and a really impressive and important historian of 20th century American history, Sarah Milov, of the University of Virginia, the author of this book, which I have a copy of, The Cigarette, and it's not, this is not a prop, this is a real thing, The Cigarette, A Political History, published last year, I think, by Harvard University Press, and soon to be available in paperback. Makes a great gift, beautiful design, and like Sarah's paper, which I think some of you hopefully will have had the chance to get a look at, and if you haven't, Professor Milov will give you, we'll offer some of the arguments and explain where she's coming from in the paper. But it has the same kind of combination of really like deep understanding of institutions and power with a really kind of sly, dry humor that I pick up on, and I really, I think really sets this book apart from a lot of other works of history writ large, but of American history in particular. So today, Sarah's presenting to us from a chapter, I think, from a new project. Maybe she can tell us a little bit about it, on the history and culture of whistleblowing. So join me in welcoming Professor Sarah Milov.
Thanks. Oh, thank you for the emojis. I feel warmly welcomed by that and by those kind words, Pedrick. I wish I could be with you at the University of Toronto today, or at least some other day soon. Maybe not today, since it's spectacular in Charlottesville, and I always get very upset when I travel and it's a nice day at home. But I do wish I could be with you. And I feel especially lucky to be presenting this work right now, because I'm at the very beginning of conceptualizing this new project. I've been watching a lot of British Bake Off during the pandemic, and I'd say that my project is in the proving drawer. It's taking on water or expanding gluten or whatever exactly happens in the proving drawer, which is to say that I am extremely grateful for whatever feedback or engagement you can offer me at this time. I'm going to do a share screen here to kind of walk you through how this fits into a larger project, how this chapter fits into a larger project. And then for those of you who have not had the chance to read the paper, to just walk through some of the themes I talk about in the paper. So I am at the beginning of a new book project, and I should say here that in this book project, which I'm tentatively calling Shrill Alarms, Whistleblowing and Democracy in Modern America, I'm trying to think about the project in a way that will appeal to a trade press and not an academic press. So I'm trying to construct an argument and craft chapters that are character driven and narrative, so that people will actually want to read the book, but along the way still illuminate what I think of as important trends in the second half, in the political economy and political culture of the second half of the 20th century. So what this project seeks to investigate is a political history of whistleblowing in the post-war United States. And it might seem strange to say I'm doing that project, because you might think, well, haven't there been books about whistleblowing in the modern United States? And the answer is no. There is one recently published edited volume about national security whistleblowing specifically, which is actually not something I'll be touching upon in my manuscript, because actually national security whistleblowers are kind of written out of the legal frameworks that protect whistleblowing. But in general, most accounts of whistleblowing tend to be, quite celebratory, written sometimes from the perspective of whistleblowers or from enthusiasts of the practice and who want to ensure that there's greater safeguards and protections. But there's been very little critical inquiry into the origins of whistleblowing itself. So what I hope to do in my book is to consider how the increasing cultural salience of whistleblowing intersected with the legal protections afforded to whistleblowers, and how these were in turn both shaped by ideas emerging in particularly after the 1960s about civil rights and workplace discrimination, feminism and sexual harassment, and deregulation and the status of desirability of bureaucracy. Also, the structure of the book, which is going to be centered around case studies of whistleblowers, reflects the fact that whistleblowing is a deeply narrative practice. Even though whistleblower protections kind of shroud whistleblowing in anonymity, whistleblowing is a deeply narrative practice and therefore rests on cultural ideas about truth and trustworthiness. So I want to interrogate how cultural ideas about who is a credible truth teller and who is merely a disgruntled employee have shaped the development of whistleblower protection laws. And moreover, I want to ask what this tells us about a regulatory system that vests workers with a duty to report waste, fraud, and abuse in the parlance of whistleblower protection. There's a tie-in here with ideas emerging about neoliberalism. How do we make sense of the expansion of whistleblower protection laws, which end up being supported by both Democrats and Republicans? If there's any Americans in the audience, the perhaps foremost advocate of expansions for whistleblower protections in the Senate comes from the conservative Republican Charles Grassley. How do we make sense of the expansion of whistleblower protections at the exact same time as other forms of federal regulation are under attack in the United States? So does whistleblowing give us a window into the privatization of regulation? Is it of a piece with neoliberalism, or does it defy what we expect in terms of neoliberalism and deregulation? I'm still in the asking questions phase of this project, which is why we have so many questions on the screen. Essentially, I'm trying to write a book that interrogates the cultural and legal history and the intertwined cultural and legal history of whistleblowing. Now, if you want to write about whistleblowing, you encounter a significant problem right at the outset, particularly in the American context, because whistleblowing is governed by laws that operate through different jurisdictions. There are federal whistleblower protection laws that govern the federal workforce for workers like Ernest Fitzgerald. There are whistleblower protection laws that exist as part of standalone statutes. So whistleblowers who work in mining, who work in the nuclear industries, they are governed by a separate set of laws, the financial industry. There are also state level whistleblower protection laws in the United States. Every year I get this email from from the Office of the State Inspector General telling me that as a state employee, I have the duty to report waste, fraud, and abuse, and I might even be entitled to a little bit of that sweet whistleblower reward money if I do so. Very usefully reminds me that you can blow the whistle on institutions of higher education. So you have state level laws operating at the same time as federal laws. And on top of that, there's an even broader world of law governing whistleblowing in the private sector. So beginning in 1986, and standing right there at the signing ceremony is Ernest Fitzgerald, a law was passed that allows people in private industry who witness their employers defrauding the government, it enables them to sue their employer on behalf of the government. These are called qui tam suits, and it's given rise to a very specialized qui tam whistleblower bar that handles these types of suits. In these cases, the US Department of Justice can decide whether or not it will intervene on behalf of the whistleblower. And most of the time, they do not. In over 90% of cases, the DOJ says, no, thanks. Or the DOJ says, oh, very interesting. We're going to go pursue it on our own. We don't need you anymore to tell us what's going on. Nevertheless, the rewards held out in these cases are quite high, so as to encourage whistleblowing and also discourage bad behavior, fraud on the part of private industry. So if a whistleblower prevails in one of these suits, they can recover between 15 and 30% of the total recovery by the government of the fraudster employer. And because the defendant, so the defrauding employer in the suit, is responsible for triple damages, whistleblower rewards can be extremely high. So for example, how high is high? For example, in 2012, Johnson & Johnson paid $2.2 billion to settle off-label fraud and kickback allegations related to some prescription drugs. In that case, the whistleblower received $167 million in rewards. The main trove of suits originating from these qui tam lawsuits, or the main industries affected by these qui tam lawsuits, tend to be, in no surprise, given the American system, in the private healthcare sector for basically engaging in insurance and Medicaid fraud. So one private healthcare services company paid $900 million to settle allegations that it engaged in bill padding and manipulated Medicare payments. And for that reporting, the whistleblower received $150 million. So these whistleblower reward programs can be quite high, and hence their significance. I should say on top of that, states have also passed versions of this law for frauds committed at the state level. So if you want to study whistleblowing, there's all these intersecting jurisdictions. And on top of that, the cardinal marker of whistleblower protection is, with only one major exception, a sort of guarantee of anonymity, especially for federal employees. After all, the best way to prevent an employer from retaliating against an employee who blows the whistle is to make sure the employer doesn't know who that employee is. This is all to say, studying whistleblowing as a historian presents special challenges. How do you write about a phenomenon when you cannot know your actors, and how your actors understood what they were doing and the stakes involved in what they were doing? So my solution to these methodological challenges, and I'd be happy to hear any thoughts on this because I'm trying to write this book for an audience in many ways like the audience here, is to design a book project structured around relatively famous whistleblowers. After all, I'm starting from the perspective that cultural ideas shape law. So it makes sense to start with whistleblowers who had a tangible impact on the perception of whistleblowing and how whistleblower law operates. So I'm playing around with some of these tentative book chapters. The only ones that I'm really dedicated to as case studies at this point is a chapter. I think Ernest Fitzgerald has to be in there. And I also think Karen Silkwood has to be in there. Other than that, There are figures I associate with each of these chapters, but I still have not found kind of the vehicle for most of these chapters yet, even though these chapters, I think, speak to what I'd like the book to interrogate. Now, what I'm hoping to do in this book is to examine in each chapter how workplace dissent was understood before the law in the time period under discussion. And these are roughly chronological here on the screen. How the truth claims of the whistleblowers were framed by the whistleblowers themselves, by their political allies, by the media, by their bosses, and by their opponents. And I'm hoping as well that this case study method will afford a look at the way workplace retaliation has evolved. It's a truism that whistleblowers experience life-changing or life-ruining blowback for their disclosures. But I'm curious about how the nature of retaliation has changed, not just since the advent of whistleblower protection as an ideal, but in response to the elaboration of human resources departments within corporate bureaucracies, as well as the rise of that lucrative but rarely won whistleblower reward programs. Something like whistleblower rewards does give some substance, at least rhetorically, to the idea that the whistleblower is doing this for money. So I'm imagining that the Ernest Fitzgerald chapter that you had today will be an early chapter in the book, though his influence in whistleblower advocacy extends beyond what you read, and perhaps he will make subsequent appearances in later chapters. Now, I thought maybe I would just give an overview of what was in the paper for those of you who didn't have a chance to read it. You might be wondering at this point, what does Ernest Fitzgerald look like? Well, here he is doing some number crunching. That is not a C5A. I think that's an F105. But I think he's looking determinedly at it. Maybe he's even figuring out where costs could have been cut in this model. So what I submitted today was my first stab about writing about Ernest Fitzgerald, who's really the first person in American life to be called and to be widely acknowledged as a whistleblower. And, despite kind of like whistleblowing in general, despite his profound influence on the practice of whistleblowing and the associations that attend to it, there's been very little written about him. He doesn't appear as even a passing character in political histories of the era. He doesn't appear in histories that examine related phenomena, such as histories of ideas of secrecy and freedom of information in the 60s and 70s. So for those who didn't get a chance to read, my paper is basically about how Fitzgerald and crucially his institutional allies in Congress and in the emerging public interest bar represented in my paper by Ralph Nader, marshaled a defense of his masculinity in order to bolster his credibility as a whistleblower. And I just want to make something clear at the outset. My argument here is not that Fitzgerald succeeded as a whistleblower or was understood as a credible truth teller because he embodied a macho style of masculinity. In fact, he didn't embody that style of masculinity, and working within the Air Force, he had to carve out an alternative style of masculinity in order to array himself effectively against it. My argument, and kind of a broader argument of my book, is that whistleblowing does not occur in a moment of disclosure, and that whistleblowers always have to marshal whatever resources they have at their disposal, and that a certain kind of gendered performance for Fitzgerald aided his defense. His presentation as hyper-rational, as cool-headed, and I think very crucially as basically reluctantly inhabiting the spotlight. Once he was there, he was happy to wage his fight. And he said, I'm not he says before an important Senate subcommittee. I'm not a shrinking violet. I'm going to call the truth like I see it. But his life prior to arriving in the limelight was not one of him seeking out confrontation. My argument is that, Fitzgerald's gender was a resource and that it dovetailed with pre-existing cultural anxieties surrounding bureaucracy and manhood, as well as with ideas held about gender embodied by his allies in Proxmire and Nader. So Fitzgerald and his allies basically explained his denunciations as an act of manhood, tapping into those powerful anxieties about the status of men in an era of large organizations. So who was this guy and what exactly was he denouncing? Well, Fitzgerald was a paper pusher. He was an organization man. He was a cost analyst at the Air Force in the late 1960s. And his job was to analyze the contracts between defense contractors, Lockheed, Boeing, these multi-billion-dollar large organizations that they had with the federal government to make the weapons of war that defined the Cold War. And most of Fitzgerald's job as a cost analyst was performed at his desk, doing accounting essentially. But sometimes as a part of his job, he went and toured the facilities where these weapon systems were made. So he'd make a trip to Marietta, Georgia. He'd make a trip to Seattle where Boeing's products were made. And on these trips, invariably, he would find evidence of waste, frequently in the form of being plied with 3 martini lunches by his handlers at the defense plant. Now, on the job as a cost analyst, Fitzgerald had clashed several times with his bosses about programs he thought were wasteful. And he was known, as perhaps other colleagues of his who were cost analysts were known as being suspicious of the way contracts were handed out by the Pentagon, frequently without a bid, a no bid contract, to favored defense contractors. The moment of disclosure in this story happens in 1968, in November of 1968, during the height of the United States' war on Vietnam, when Fitzgerald testifies before a Senate subcommittee about a $2 billion cost overrun on an aircraft contract that the Pentagon has with Lockheed. That contract is for an aircraft called the C-5A, which was supposed to be the largest transport plane to date, like the size basically of a football field. Now, I should mention here that when Fitzgerald testifies, he knows that he is going to arouse the ire of his bosses. His bosses know he's going to testify in front of the Senate subcommittee, chaired by the progressive Wisconsin Democrat, William Proxmire, but they prohibit him from supplying his advanced testimony that Proxmire would ask for from every witness. They don't want him to give his testimony in written form in advance. And so when when Fitzgerald does sit there on the stand, his disclosure about cost overruns is also a kind of disclosure about a cover-up, because he's also announcing his boss's opposition to the idea that he should be there speaking at all. Now, Fitzgerald's brief time on the witness stand garners a tremendous amount of interest in Congress and a tremendous amount of interest from mainstream media, particularly the Times and the Washington Post. His testimony dovetails with already existing opposition to the Pentagon's techniques of procurement. And there's a real intensifying drive to understand what exactly is going on at the Pentagon if they're happy to spend this much on the C-5A project. And at the same time, this interest is intensified because weeks later, Fitzgerald begins to experience retaliation from his bosses, from his disclosures. He was essentially demoted. His civil service tenure was cut, which is a very big deal for somebody who works for the federal government. It's like losing academic tenure. It basically means you can be fired at will at any time. In terms of day-to-day affairs, he's taken off the C5A project, obviously, and reassigned to examining the costs of mess halls and bowling alleys. When he balks at the fact that why should we be constructing a bowling alley for our boys in Thailand, he's taken off that project as well. So 1969, the subsequent year, was quite bad for Fitzgerald. And also I should note for the C5A, which repeatedly failed in subsequent trial runs, though it does not stop the Pentagon from purchasing even more of the doomed aircraft transporter. About a year to the day after he testifies, Fitzgerald was fired on the orders of President Richard Nixon. This is kind of ironic because what Fitzgerald was actually disclosing had to do with Pentagon practices under Johnson. But Nixon basically correctly perceives disloyalty and a squeaky wheel in the figure of Fitzgerald. Another interesting coda to this story that we might be hearing more about, at least in the United States, is Fitzgerald later sues Nixon for damages, basically alleging that he's fired in retaliation for his testimony. And his case makes its way to the Supreme Court because it's a consequential question about the limits, if any, of presidential powers. So the Supreme Court in a 5-4 decision rules in 1982 that the president was entitled to absolute immunity for acts performed within the, quote, outer perimeter of his authority. So I guess you could say that in the course of his disclosure, Fitzgerald actually did secure an enhanced measure of workplace protection for at least one worker, just that worker happened to be the president. So I suspect we might be hearing more about Nixon v. Fitzgerald soon as questions arise about Trump's immunity as president. Now, in the paper, I suggest that Fitzgerald's success as a whistleblower was due, at least in part, to the fact that very powerful men praised him very publicly and framed his disclosures as an act of manhood, as an act of manly virtue. And that Fitzgerald's self-presentation, the fact that he was essentially embodying the breadwinner ideal, that he was an educated white man, reinforced common understandings of masculinity, race, and bureaucracy. Specifically, Fitzgerald's disclosed into a political culture primed to associate his attack on bureaucracy as an act of manhood. You can see here in some of these book covers that the 1950s and 1960s had really witnessed a welter of very influential and well-regarded books that were essentially indictments of bureaucracy. David Reisman's Lonely Crowd, C. Wright Mills' White Collar, and William White's Organization Man. And I guess you could add to this too, Man in the Gray Flannel Suit. Now, all of these argue essentially that the rise of large corporations in the post-war United States were changing society and really, especially in the case of Reisman, individual personality for the worse. And these books were, I think, above all, an indictment of your bureaucracy's effects on manhood, which, at least in the imaginary of these books, had been really in decline since the 19th century, and maybe even with the closing of the mythical Western frontier. As C. Wright Mills put it, the 20th century white-collar man has never been as independent as the farmer used to be. He is now always somebody's man, the corporation, the governments, the armies. And so, if a man was not himself, And if he belonged to somebody else, it raises the question, was he a man at all? So this is part of the cultural milieu that Fitzgerald is making his denunciations within. But I also point out that Fitzgerald's congressional patron, Senator William Proxmire from Wisconsin, who is thought of himself as a progressive Democrat, also matters a great deal in this story. Proxmire also embodies a kind of alternative manhood, one characterized by, I guess, like a connection between fiscal and corporeal rectitude. Proxmire's physical habits were really the stuff of legend, as you can kind of get a hint in this profile from the New York Times. He would run to work and run back from work, which meant he was running 10 miles to work every day. He ate a very Spartan diet. He once reprimanded an aide, allegedly, for eating a chocolate donut. And he really makes his name in the late 1960s by issuing indictments of government waste. And so he kind of hitches his star in a way to Ernest Fitzgerald, who for him embodies the ideal kind of federal worker. You can see these are two titles that Proxmire wrote, Report from Wasteland and The Fleecing of America. So Fitzgerald is crucial to, in a way, Proxmire's story as well. Now, a couple of years, this is kind of adjacent to the story, but a couple of years after this Fitzgerald episode, Proxmire would start issuing what he called the Golden Fleece Awards for the most ridiculous or ironic example of government spending or waste. And his first Golden Fleece Award actually goes to the NSF for funding a study, not coincidentally, I don't think, a study whose two principal investigators were female PhD psychologists that examine the physical and emotional elements of sexual desire. And he actually succeeds in getting the funding for this study revoked, and he also succeeded in getting one of the scientists fired from her job. But through proffering himself up as this exemplar of rectitude, what Proxmire helps to put forth the idea of the taxpayer as the ultimate victim of basically workplace retaliation that adhered to a whistleblower like Fitzgerald. So Proxmire helps to advance the argument that what whistleblowers do is protect the public's pocketbook. And this is interesting, I think, in terms of elaborating a left-wing component to what one scholar has called taxpayerism as a discourse in American political life. So for scholars of US history, it's a well-accepted argument that beginning with the New Deal in the 1930s, conservatives argue against the expansion of government programs by invoking the taxpayer. Ronald Reagan kind of perfects this language, and we've been living with the aftermath ever since. But I think what's thinking through whistleblowing illuminates is the left-wing politics of taxpayerism, as well as its contribution to the movement to protect whistleblowers. So I think in subsequent versions of this, I'd like to maybe explore the gender dynamics of taxpayerism a little bit more. Now, even in its left-wing version, taxpayerism still presents a tight association between private wealth and public worth, as if paying more taxes or having more skin in the game might entitle you to more decision-making power, or, as in the case of the Golden Fleece Awards, veto power over what the government funds. This, of course, tends to reinforce commonly held ideas about what researchers do and what research looks like. Finally, coming together at the same time for Fitzgerald is a new movement of young public interest lawyers spearheaded by Ralph Nader that are also seeking to bring accountability to government bureaucracies. Now, it's been overshadowed by Ralph Nader's association with the consumer movement, or his association with George W. Bush's victory. But Nader was a keenly interested too, as Proxmire was, in the cost of bureaucracy to the American taxpayer. This is also an approach that he shares with Fitzgerald. Beginning in the late 1960s and increasing throughout the 1970s, Nader and his so-called Nader Raiders, which are basically summer interns from elite universities and elite law schools, occasionally med schools, launch investigations into different bureaucracies of the federal government. And these basically, the fruits of these labors manifest as these really hastily and poorly written mass market paperback indictments of government waste. When I say there's a lot, I mean, we've only touched the surface. If you want to read any of these, I would recommend the one on the Federal Trade Commission. It's the first and I think the best, but they're all very bad. So what emerges from this as regards to whistleblowing is Nader sponsors a conference in 1971, the first real whistleblower conference in the United States, where Fitzgerald is one of a handful of invited speakers. And the vision of whistleblowing that emerges from this conference, I think, is significant and underappreciated. And the vision that emerges is one that is as much about professional prerogative and the obligations of professionals as it is about principled disclosure. So when Nader speaks about whistleblowing, and all of the whistleblowers assembled embody this, he imagines them as members of the professional classes, people who have a postgraduate degree, people who belong to professional organizations. Here too, we see the sort of gender, race, and class bias of the Nader movement. If you think about who's constituting the membership in this elite world of professional societies. And so to imagine whistleblowing as something that professionals do is really to imagine an educated middle-class man performing an act of reasoned restraint that he logically concludes he must do because of how he's been trained and professionalized. I think that I'll leave it there. I've probably gone on quite enough, and I think I've captured essentially the essence of what was going on in my paper. So I just look forward to a conversation.
So on behalf of my colleagues and my students, actually, who turned out in numbers, from the Center for Industrial Relations and Human Resources and the Center for Diaspora and Transnational Studies, I want to thank Sarah Milov for joining us. And I hope if you enjoyed this seminar that you'll join us for the last one of the season next month. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you all.